You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art ed?
We'll try to slice it.
Who art ed? Mr. Wood art ed me.
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, Weekly Art History for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I have Tony Stevens, the producer of a new documentary called Possibilities that has been doing wonderfully on the film festival circuit, winning all sorts of awards. And I love it because it's bringing up issues of accessibility in the visual arts. And so thank you so much for joining me, Tony Stevens.
Thank you so much, Kyle. It's fantastic to be here. Thanks.
Plug the pluggables right off the bat. The film just hit Apple TV, right?
Yeah, we're on Apple TV, Amazon Prime, and Tubi. And for educators and folks in universities and libraries, we're also on Biblio Plus and Canopy.
Yeah, and this is a documentary that is about Helen Keller, but I feel like it's so much more than that, right? Like it's about inclusion and accessibility, and can you talk a little bit about that before we get deeper into this?
Yeah, sure. So Helen Keller. Most folks know of Helen through The Miracle Worker. They learn about her in school. In elementary school, you might learn that, she was a woman that was deafblind, and through her teacher, Anne Sullivan, she was able to finally communicate when she was 7 years old. She was sort of in isolation for 7 years of her life. And there was this great story of Helen at a well, and when she began to feel the water, and then Anne Sullivan was doing tactile sign language, where she takes her hand and you literally basically spell out in the palm of another person's hand what you're communicating. And it was literally and metaphorically a watershed moment for her, right? Where suddenly she learned to communicate, and then she went on to do amazing things. But a lot of people don't know about a lot of the amazing things. But what we wanted to do was create a documentary that focused on as we celebrate 250 years of independence, she's definitely an American icon for independence, particularly for people that are blind or deafblind or low vision. And it was something where we wanted to sort of bring the stories of her impact and her legacy through the stories of people who are blind today and kind of capture that. And accessibility is a huge theme within our community. I'm blind myself, and it's something in conversations that, often people kind of ignore accessibility and access. And what does that mean? And what does independence mean? So we really try to capture those stories and bring it to people. And I like to think we brought it in a very accessible, innovative way, which was one of the things we're really proud about the film.
Yeah. And, I want to get deeper into the film and your approach to it a little bit later on, because I think it is really interesting and innovative watching the clips and hearing the descriptions and all of that to make it, like we say, accessible for people, whether they can see or not. But before we get into all that, you are the producer of the film. You are also assistant vice president of communications at the American Foundation of the Blind. I always like a good origin story to start stuff off. So can you talk a little bit about your background? And, you've kind of alluded to some of this, but I'm guessing there's more. Like, why Helen Keller was a compelling subject for you. I mean, she's probably one of the most famous figures in history that we all kind of feel like we know something about just from hearing the name. But why did you feel her story was important to tell, or what new insights did you feel you could bring to it? I've got 10 questions in there, so pick whichever ones you want to answer.
Well, they're all good. The American Foundation for the Blind, we were founded in 1921, and Helen actually came to work for us in 1924, pretty much up to her death in 1968. She kind of phased out after she had a stroke in the 60s and went into retirement at her home in a place called Arkin Ridge in Connecticut. Most of those years she was in New York City, where we were headquartered at the time. And really, it was just a force to be reckoned with. She was a goodwill ambassador that General MacArthur put her in that role after World War II. She traveled to 39 countries. She was a rock star, right? Honorary doctorate from Harvard and other universities. And, she was more than just the first deafblind woman to graduate from college, right? she was actually interred at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. in the crypt, along with Anne Sullivan and Polly Thompson, who Polly worked with Anne Sullivan and Helen, in the 19 teens up to when Anne passed away, and then Polly took over as her main interpreter. But, she really was this force to be reckoned with. So we wanted to try to capture that story to AFB because she was like part of our family, right? She was in the office, like she was this larger than life person than most people, but like, we have people that can remember, telling stories about when she loved to go to Coney Island and get a hot dog, right? Like she was just a normal person in a lot of ways. And, in a lot of sense with that, we wanted to try to tell her story. It was at her 100th anniversary when we started this project to get the film out. And, for myself, I come from journalism background and have been working in communications. I'm blind myself, been blind since I was 15. And, she was this larger than life person. I'm one of several producers. 3 of us were blind out of the 5 producers in the film that the American Foundation for the Blind really worked with a Beach Glass Films out of California to get this film made. And, we wanted to tell a story that really captured an authentic representation of what people who are blind are like. I mean, most people maybe haven't come in contact with someone who's blind, and to really kind of sort of set the stage, because everyone thinks we're like superheroes, either if you're Daredevil or you're some pity person, right? Like from Oedipus Rex on, throughout history and stories, blindness was seen as a tragedy. We're just like everybody else. And so we wanted to try to bring that authentic representation, and felt that it would be really good to sort of anchor it in the impact that, Helen really set the stage for, I think, a lot of the stories that folks hear in the film.
What I liked, watching, there's so many different types of people in, like there is some commonality of, blindness or whatever. But you say there are 2 archetypes that people have in their head, but really it's all of humanity is encompassed in there. And, I like seeing, whether it's the little kid talking about how, he wants to play baseball or be announcer for baseball, or, like there's the full spectrum in there.
Yeah.
And I think
we tackle it from schools all the way to, people trying to find work and the discrimination that still exists to this day because of the misconceptions around blindness. We focus on some of the celebration, but on some of the challenges. One of the folks in the film says, we're like playing the game of life on hard.
Mm-hmm. And
when you're blind, or if you have any kind of disability, you have to kind of try to work out life hacks, right? To kind of figure things out. But that's the same for everybody, right? Everyone has challenges. Our challenges just happen to be tied to these things in our head that are the sense organ for vision and sight.
Yeah. And, I also like how you talk about like Helen Keller is getting, liking to get the hot dogs in Coney Island, and not just because like, so many people have their idea of like, the big monumental achievements, whether it's the breakthrough that was depicted in The Miracle Worker, or, you mentioned the honorary doctorate and the speaking engagements. But like, I think there's always something really nice about drilling down to the everyday of a person, even like the seemingly larger than life person, to realize at the end of the day, they were just a person who had a lot of the same sort of normal experiences the rest of us do. I think it makes it very relatable.
It definitely does. She was a real, she had her struggles and challenges and ups and downs and, relationships. And it, we didn't want the documentary to be something that you might experience in the sense of like a biography about Helen.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much stuff out there that's done that and has already been done. But we wanted to kind of find the threads of Helen's life and the challenges she probably very well faced, and how in some ways we've overcome some of those thanks to like things like the Americans with Disabilities Act. But in some ways, there's some of the things that we're still wrestling with today. 100 years after she came to work with AFB, we're still sort of wrestling with that.
I want to dive fully into the process for the artwork.
Yeah.
You've made a beautiful film. Can you talk about how that all came together? And I am a bit of a nerd, so I would love to hear everything from the pitch meeting, storyboarding, how you planned, how are we going to tackle all these different things? How are we going to select the people to come in? What stories are we going to tell?
Yeah.
You've always got to make those editorial choices along the way. Can you
You do.
just walk us
Yeah.
through the process?
Well, for sure. I mean, we knew we wanted to do something around our coming up to our 100th anniversary that focused on our greatest ambassador at AFB, who was Helen, no doubt about it. And, initially, we started capturing interviews. I mean, the thing about a documentary, sometimes you don't know what the story is. You have an idea or a seed. But as you start interviewing people and talking with people, sometimes different stories come out. And so, like many documentaries, this one sort of evolved. And, it's a sense that, the more we started talking to people and we started seeing these common threads, I mean, we have over 90 hours of footage that we shot for a 99-minute documentary. And that's not totally uncommon for documentaries, but it's within when you get all that footage together and you start saying, okay, what is the story here, right? And so we segmented into certain aspects of education, certain areas that were major things Helen did to lift up, right? Independence and mobility, just being able to move freely as a person that's blind or deafblind or low vision. Ways that technology maybe can help, people and things like that. Ways for how we can be more independent, right? And again, we're talking about 250 years of independence for our country every day now. It seems like around, the 4th of July in this year, but it really is. I mean, she's an enormous icon for independence, and independence means a lot for people that are blind or people with disabilities in general. Mm-hmm. And so, as we started getting these stories together, so Bill Sarine, our director, who's fantastic, was the one that was really working to piece these 90 hours and to carve it into something that could be, seen in a movie theater. We didn't want to make it. No one loves a 3-hour documentary unless you're Ken Burns and you can break it into television series and things like that. But, I think the stories that started to rise up, we began to, or Bill mainly with the editor began to sort of piece all this stuff together. And one thing though that was unique was we talk about accessibility. We wanted this to be accessible for people that are blind or have low vision. Mm-hmm. But the way that we wanted to present it to the audience was so that everybody had the same shared experience. Because you talk to people with disabilities, and it's not that we want more of something. We just want what everybody else has, in a sense, right? We want equal access to things. We want equal inclusion and all that stuff. And so, Bill really germinated on this. And one of his best friends was one of the first people he met when he moved to California to get into the film industry. I mean, he worked for Disney for years and years and on major projects like Pirates of the Caribbean and Pearl Harbor and some other major films. And, he knew how great entertainment could be. But one of the first folks he met was a guy named Roy Samuelson, who's an audio description narrator and probably one of the best. And we'll talk a little bit about what AD means and the art of AD, which was really anchored in this film in an innovative way. But Roy is this sort of rock star in the audio description world, which is a way that people who are blind or have other disabilities or, challenges in following a film, it's verbal things that are said in the pauses, right? Mm-hmm. And it's typically something that's done after the film has been wrapped, and directors usually don't have a role in it. Bill, with Roy as one of his best friends, was like, let's bring the audio description team in right at the beginning and, start thinking about it so that as we're piecing this together and you start finding a narrative that exists in a documentary, because you don't want to just be random scenes throughout. You want it to follow some sort of, an arc and that story or stories in this sense. Let's bring in the audio description team that does the writing typically after something's been wrapped and they're just dealing with it so they can get on a network TV or in a multiplex theater and be accessible. Let's bring them on early on and start finding ways that the story can tell itself visually from an artistic perspective, but also audibly as well for the description that's taking place. So, that was one of the things that is often left as an afterthought, but we definitely wanted to make sure it was brought in at the beginning, and Bill did a wonderful job with Roy and his team Satana Howery is like a narrator. She's the audio description narrator, but it's almost like a narrator in the film. If you check out Seinfeld on Netflix right now, you'll hit a little button that says AD in the accessibility settings, and then you can hear Satana's voice there. You can hear her all over the place. She's everywhere for describing stuff. And so we thought she would be fantastic to bring in, and she did a wonderful job. Where it's almost like even a couple of times in the film, she sort of breaks the fourth wall of what audio description is, and it makes it not just a science, but an art in of itself, the way that you incorporate the AD into the film. So as much as there was, the visual traditional editing that goes on, like, okay, well, let's capture this B-roll shots and let's piece this together. And all right, we're talking about guide dogs. Let's get a great scene of, our subject walking with a guide dog across a park, or let's show what it looks like visually for someone blind using a white cane to try to navigate tough intersections. The audio description team was there the whole way to kind of say, well, let's focus in maybe on this, and we can describe it this way, and it could be part of the story as well.
Okay, so there are so many things that are really interesting there to me, and I'm going to want to get into the audio descriptions a little bit later. But before we get into that, I do want to ask a little bit about the process, because as I hear you saying it, you said you kind of knew, obviously, Helen Keller and accessibility as a core idea, but you gathered footage and then let the stories evolve. And so, that to me sounds like a terrifying process, because, if I'm going to break the fourth wall right here, even though I like to let the conversation evolve naturally, I already start off in my head with this structure of, okay, first I'm going to go for backgrounds. Second, I'm going to delve into the work. And third, I'm going to wrap things up with takeaways for the audience. I've got kind of a structure in my head already for how I want the narrative flow. And you're telling me that you went into this thinking we'll get a bunch of footage and then figure out what narrative comes out of that. And to me, that seems really hard to wrap my head around. Did you have an idea of beyond the subject, we want to tell this type of a story, or was it really just respond to what people said? And did anyone say things that surprised you? Were there insights and things that were unexpected along the way?
There was definitely something that surprised me, and we felt it at various festival screenings, depending on what festival we were at. But definitely, yeah, I mean, we knew going in, some of the key questions were, what does Helen Keller mean to you as someone with a disability today? I mean, that was kind of the thesis right at the top, right? Let's capture the impact, Helen Keller's legacy today. But then you start hearing people tell their other stories, right? About, independence. Well, what does independence mean for you? What does accessibility mean to you, right? What is getting access? Well, independent means I have access to stuff. Well, what does that mean? So in those follow-up questions that take place during interviews, and I'm on the screen a few times during the film as well myself, awkwardly. I hate hearing myself. But it's that thing where I was kind of trying to, we came in and interviewed me as well, and kind of to bridge some of the sections together. It's kind of a talking head in some instances. But, as we were getting more and more of these stories, just some of the things people said really resonated. Like Thomas Reed, who's also an audio describer. He's a blind audio describer out of Pennsylvania. He has this great line of, Helen is great, right? And the whole world thinks of Helen as she represents everybody. But he says it's about time we start hearing from other voices as well, right? I mean, Helen passed away in 1968, and she's just as important as other historical figures throughout our 250 years of independence in this country. But we need to make sure that we're hearing from other people as well, because our experiences are so unique across, depending on who you are. It could be completely different, how you learn how to use a cane, or if you use a guide dog, or if you read Braille or you don't read Braille. What's your economic condition? What is it? What is your background? And some of those stories just really, kind of gut punch you. Like, we have stuff where people are just told the no's that we hear a lot as people that aren't surprised if you're someone with a disability, that when someone just says, no, I'm not going to see you, I'm not going to accept you, I'm going to have this misconception about you. But on the positive side, one thing that really started to resonate is these shared experiences that there's almost like, and it's referred to once in the film about blind joy. And everybody thinks, AFB did a study like, I don't know, 20 something years ago where people feared blindness more than cancer, right? Terminal cancer. And it's those things that people are fearful about it. But at the same time, we can also sort of find this celebration and this blind joy. And it was this kind of like a pride that, we're playing life on hard, like a video game, said at one point in the film. And that resonated when we were doing festivals, and there would be, we'd be able to tap into the local blindness community, and they would show up. You would hear some cheers, and yeah, that's it. You got it, right? The things that resonated and kind of reminded us that there is this sense of pride that you're not alone. And oftentimes blindness, one of the biggest challenges of blindness is the isolation that people face. I mean, people sometimes are even stuck on their couch for a year or two, afraid to go outside. And this kind of had this sort of sense amongst our screenings that there's this shared sort of, we've gone through this and we're not alone. So that kind of surprised me, the way that resonated with particular audiences with disabilities, which we made this film for the broad public. And we wanted to educate the world that maybe didn't know someone who's blind. But at the same time, we found it really being just sort of a powerful affirmation within our own community. And that's been very uplifting in a sense. So we definitely didn't sort of see that as a goal when we started this project.
So then, as these themes start to emerge, as you're reviewing the footage and everything like that and trying to put it together, do you find yourself thinking like, oh, now we've got this new theme coming up and we're going to need to get more footage to complete that? Or like, did you have everything?
We had to get some footage. And that's why I kind of was brought in to kind of weave some things together. I mean, on camera, I was working on it in other ways, but, the producer behind the scenes type stuff. But it definitely kind of, Bill had to, we were last minute scheduling before we did our first screening. We were pretty much getting things edited almost up to that point. And a few months before, we're capturing interviews, and usually you'll capture interviews and it might spend the next 6 months to a year working on all that post-production stuff. But no, Bill was capturing some interviews up to, Dallas and Los Angeles had sent crews out to capture some extra footage and stuff like that to kind of like a researcher would kind of, have a hypothesis and then find data that goes, that moment, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of said, well, let's ask this question again to someone else and see if it resonates, right? Are we on to something, on a theme? And that's why the film is sort of laid out in certain sort of chapters that focus on Helen's areas of major impact historically. But then the threads of the story kind of build out from that. And I think that was one of those things that, as it was beginning to get edited and screening through all the footage, saying, maybe let's find a couple other voices, which is why there are a lot of voices. It's 33 people that are subjects throughout the documentary, which is a lot for a doc. Usually a doc is like one person focused. But I think through focusing on that 33, you see commonalities that really affirm that, this is for the better or for the worse. For someone who's blind, deafblind, or has low vision, these things kind of exist through these threaded stories throughout.
And then, just to circle back to, you've already talked a bit about the audio descriptions, but for those who have yet to take in the documentary possibilities, again, links in the show notes if you want to find it on various streaming platforms. But what's unique about this is the audio description is there for all of us, right? And that it was there from the start. And I am trying to wrap my head around the order of operations there, because it's like, how do you have a description before you have the footage? Can you talk a bit about how you went about that process of creating it, and how it's maybe a little bit different from the typical process?
I mean, typically the director will have a vision, right? And they'll shoot it, and then they'll edit it, and then they'll add sound, like score, music, sound effects, background sounds, all that kind of stuff. They overlay in post-production and things like that. With this particular piece, it was, the story was kind of laying itself out in the arc. But I mean, one of the joyous things of my job is also too under my plate is the Helen Keller archives, where a lot of this footage, the B-roll footage or photographs, newspaper clippings, all that stuff that's featured as well, is in there as well. And it's how much do you show that's going to be strictly visual, versus how much real estate do you give to make sure that you can also have the audible experience along with it, right? So as an editor could think of like, okay, I could do this whole vignette or this whole section of the film, or certain segments that have a certain visual aesthetic, a different visual look, and get all those shots, but never give thought to the audio description. How is this going to sound to a person as much as look, right? Mm-hmm. So it definitely, the choices that Bill made were influenced with the fact of knowing that, okay, we're going to need to give space for this. We're not going to have just talking heads all the time. It's mainly in the editing process that audio description really sort of took root in sort of its innovative way, to make sure that you give the breath to have a narrator come through and not just say, and then Helen Keller did this for so many years, and then she did this for so many years, and then this person is working at this place. And, it's more of making sure that you have, what is it they say in music production, even in the art of music, you just don't want to be loud all the time. I mean, I like punk music, and stuff like that, but you can be just as powerful in the silence. I think folks like Philip Glass and other composers would really respect that in the idea. And it's those pauses that the story can also be told audibly along with the visual. And that's where, traditionally audio description is a science. You got to technically get it to fit within certain segments, very quick pauses in action in particular. And you have to try to explain a lot. And it's just as much as a science, though, as an art. And we wanted to lean a little bit more heavier on the art, about, how do we say certain things. Like there's a great line where this one person, Conchita, is talking about when she lost her sight, she didn't want to have to use a white cane. And she says, it doesn't make me look cute. And I remember, it's not for me. And then it cuts to a scene with Conchita walking in the mall in Washington, D.C., or by the Capitol. And Satana, and the writers said, wouldn't it be fun if we kind of, again, break the fourth wall in a sense from audio descriptions, it typically is, and say, Conchita walks in front of the Capitol looking cute, with a white cane looking cute. And it really, even at a point when Satana comes out on the screen and says, we're spotlighting all the things that blind people are doing. And she says, and this is me reading a Braille reader describing this very film at this moment, right? So, things like that, to sort of punch in there that the AD writers were doing, is kind of an art in itself too.
It is. And, I always love those moments when there's a little, sort of wink at the audience or a break of the fourth wall. And that's an interesting thing to think about, the way the pacing of it, because as somebody who deals with a lot of audio, you're right. Like I'm usually trying to cut out every dead space and everything like that. But you need those moments. You utilized it so beautifully.
Well, I mean, when you think about it, so much of film as an art medium, when we break the fourth wall, it's always what happens. There's the wink. There's the person that looks at the camera, right? That's where the fourth wall technically is in a soundstage. You've got three walls and you got this big open space where, a camera's on a dolly, and that's the fourth wall, right? Yeah. So they always say, don't look at the camera. Don't look at the camera. The director very well could have said, Conchita, okay, Conchita just said this. All right, now Conchita, I want to contrast this by showing a picture of you walking with a cane in front of the Capitol, right? And, they could even say and turn to the camera and wink, haha, look at me, I have a cane. It would have been such an easy thing to show visually that would have been lost on our audience of people that are blind, like myself. And I say our, the eye, in a sense, it would have been lost on me. And I thought Bill and Roy were great, and the AD writers were great when they They said, no, I mean, they just as well could have cut to a shot of Conchita. And you're like, well, there's a blind person with a cane. What's the, it would, the line wouldn't have landed the same way.
Yeah.
In that fourth wall, but it was the words, right? I mean, words, and I think that's it in a lot of ways. Like people ask me, I don't listen to audio description in every movie because sometimes it's sometimes not always done that well. But I lean towards dialogue films. And that's my favorite type of cinemas. Give me a good script and I'll be there immediately, right? I'll take my kids to see Marvel movies, but I'm not horribly into them because there is so much going on that even the audio description can't capture everything. And so, the words matter. And I think for people making art and making film, words can be very, very powerful in storytelling and the way people describe things. We do this a lot. I've been consulting on audio description for years. And like we would talk to news anchors and weather people, weather meteorologists and say like, look, because technically, network television has to have audio description during primetime hours, according to the FCC, but the news does not. If a tornado is barreling at you on a weather map, how do you know it, right? And if the weather meteorologist is saying, and as you'll see here, this front is moving through, and it could be a front moving right over your driveway, and you don't know it, right? You're like, oh, that's my street. So, getting people in the biz that's a visual medium, television, film, other things, words can be powerful and descriptive words can be non-intrusive for the sighted, but enormously uplifting and giving access to people that maybe don't see that or process it the same way. Because, we find AD works very well too for people perhaps that have autism, other disabilities, the same way that you can go places and find captioning on at a restaurant, sports bar or something like that, closed captioning on. AD has its purpose, not just for our community of people that are blind, but other ways. But I think, we're trying to get out there and say, look, this is a way for access where words can be just as powerful as the visual. And, it's the first full-length film that we know of that has had an audio description that's open for everybody. You don't have to go to your settings on your TV and hit some button, or you don't have to get this clunky device at a multiplex theater that hardly ever works with headphones and they're not feeling comfy on your ears where you're trying to enjoy a film. We wanted everybody to sort of have the equal experience and also let people know that, again, it's the art of audio description, I think, that really makes it, one of the things that makes the film most innovative.
I think what's really nice is not just that everybody gets the same experience, but we realize the power of words and the description because, as we've talked about, there are little jokes that only work because of the audio description.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Those fourth wall moments, you need everybody to be brought into that with everybody included in the open audio description. And I think that's really nice. And I gotta say, thinking about how the news has to be described, the weather thing you described there is a scenario that like I hadn't thought about, but it makes perfect sense. And now I'm thinking about how frequently do I use my words effectively to describe things? And I feel like I'm better than I used to be, but still probably have a lot of room for growth in that domain. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, and when we talk about like breaking the fourth wall, I'm not advocating that we, if you're doing a serious drama, that you start cracking jokes with audio description, like, oh, and can you check out her hair? No, nothing like that. But it is something, and like you were saying, that and again, that experience with the news, we learned that in that it's another way to process information, and I think sometimes the sighted world takes for granted the importance that the ears can have in a visual medium as well.
Yeah. And so now, just to sort of wrap this up, what are you hoping the audience takes away from this film? Like we've talked quite a bit about it, but if someone is going to check out Possibilities, what are you hoping is their big takeaway? And I'm going to put you on the spot with another question that I'm just thinking of now. But I have a lot of creators who listen to this show, creators in different media, and in different ways. But what would you hope that people are mindful of to make sure that their work is accessible and open to a most diverse audience possible?
So I think the main takeaway for the film was we're wanting people to understand the blindness perspective. And Helen Keller is the biggest doorway into that, because our community is broad, blind, deafblind, low vision. Roughly 8 million Americans are legally blind, but then, about 42 million can't read the New York Times even with their glasses, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a big swash of people. And they're very diverse. And sometimes you're around it and you're awkward. And it's the misconceptions that are rooted just in a lack of information. So, the American Foundation for the Blind, we're here to sort of change perceptions around what is blindness and break down those misconceptions. So that was our key thrust, I think. For the artistic person, art can be expressive even to people that can't see. Even for Helen Keller, she, one of my favorite books that Helen wrote is called Teacher. And it was written in 1946, 10 years after her best friend and teacher, Anne Sullivan, passed away. And the opening for the book is this moving description of her climbing the Acropolis steps in Greece. And this place that is seen as one of the iconic, visually stunning sights of the world, she's able to absorb it and able to soak it in. She had traveled 39 countries. She'd been around the world, and yet she never could see it or hear it. But it doesn't mean it wasn't moving. We had our opening premiere for the film in New York at Carnegie Hall on Helen's 146th birthday, June 27th. That was the day it was released online. Folks can check it out on Apple TV, Amazon, Tubi, et cetera. We had it at Carnegie Hall. And that's a music venue, a famous music venue. Helen spoke there a very passionate speech in 1916. But then she also went back to experience the symphony. Like she could feel it through the vibrations, right? The corpuscles on the skin. And I think for artists to know that even people that may not experience your art the way you experience it doesn't mean they can't appreciate it and be moved by it. I go to museums now, and you would think, well, why is a blind person going to a museum? It can still be very moving in the descriptions that people have that captures maybe what that artist was feeling at that moment. And so I think, for artists, blind people, if you're a visual medium, they can still get a lot out of it and challenge you to be creative for how can you create art that speaks to everybody? And there are ways to do that. There's folks like Roy that started the Audio Description Network Alliance that, I mentioned worked on our film, but that's a great resource online. And the Audio Description Project at the American Council of the Blind gives a lot of resources and where to find audio description. And it's in the performing arts now and theaters and Broadway and stuff like that. Art can be appreciated by everybody. And I think artists, who doesn't want, in a sense, to make art that speaks to all? I think that's, that's why people create art, to try to communicate something through whatever medium to others. So we're just making sure that it's communicable. That's a hard word to say, but that it can be communicated to others. And I challenge artists, think out of the box, find ways to make your medium a medium that speaks to those who you may not think would perceive it the same way that maybe you do. Folks forget that Monet was legally blind himself, and his whole perspectives and the way he saw things influenced the way he painted. And, it's things like that to say that, art can be perceived differently from the artist and those that look upon it or listen upon it.
I cannot think of a more beautiful thought to end on. So I'm just going to say thank you so much for taking the time to join us and share your insights. Tony Stevens, the film is called Possibilities. You can find it in the links in the show notes. And of course, Apple TV, Tubi, all the different platforms it's on. It's a wonderful documentary, an incredible achievement. And thank you for sharing it with us.
My pleasure. Thanks, Kyle.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.